What if I told you that the moment they pulled away from you wasn't the end, but the exact moment you had the most power to change everything? Most people panic, chase, double text, and try to fix the rejection, and without realizing it, they go to avoidant even further away. But here's the part no one tells you. When someone with an avoidant mindset distances themselves, they're not just rejecting you. They're trying to regulate their own emotions, and your reaction becomes the deciding factor in whether they ever feel safe enough to come back. This is where things get interesting, because the response they expect from you is the very thing that confirms their fears. Yet there's one completely different move that disrupts that pattern, sparks their curiosity, and makes them start thinking about you in a way they didn't before. It's subtle, it's counterintuitive, and if you get it right, it can completely shift the dynamic, but almost nobody does it correctly. What feels like rejection from an avoidant person often isn't a clean, final decision about you. It's a protective reaction that has far more to do with their internal wiring than your actual value. People with avoidant tendencies are highly sensitive to emotional closeness, not because they don't feel, but because they feel in a way that can quickly become overwhelming. So when things start getting real or meaningful, their instinct is to create distance to regain a sense of control. From your perspective, it looks like they've suddenly lost interest or shut the door, but from theirs, it's more like hitting an emotional pause button to calm the intensity. This is why it can feel so confusing. They may have genuinely enjoyed the connection, yet still pull away right when things seem to be going well. If you immediately react with chasing, over-explaining, or trying to prove your worth, you unintentionally confirm the very fear that caused them to withdraw in the first place, the fear that closeness will lead to pressure, loss of independence, or emotional overwhelm. In that sense, their rejection becomes a kind of unconscious test, not in a manipulative or calculated way, but as a way of seeing whether the connection will remain safe or become suffocating. They're observing, often without even realizing it, whether you respect the space or resist it. When you resist it, the distance grows because it reinforces their need to protect themselves. But when you respond with calmness, self-respect, and a willingness to let things breathe, something subtle shifts in their perception. They no longer feel the same urgency to escape. This doesn't guarantee they'll come running back, and it's important to stay grounded in that reality, but it does change the emotional equation. Instead of being seen as a source of pressure, you become someone associated with ease and emotional safety, which is far more compelling to an avoidant mind than intensity or pursuit. The key is understanding that their withdrawal is not a puzzle you solve by doing more, but a dynamic you influence by doing less. By not taking it personally, by not collapsing your sense of self in response, and by allowing them the space they instinctively seek without turning it into a power struggle. When you shift from reacting to understanding, you stop feeding the cycle that pushes them away and start creating the conditions where they can, at their own pace, feel curious enough to re-engage. When an avoidant person pulls away, most people react in ways that feel natural but actually make things worse. They chase, they seek reassurance. They try to talk everything through immediately, or they overextend themselves to prove they're worth staying for. On the surface, these responses come from care and genuine intention, but to someone who already feels overwhelmed by closeness, they register as pressure, urgency, and a loss of emotional space. That's why the usual reactions tend to push an avoidant even further into distance. But there's one response that completely disrupts this pattern, and it's not what most people expect. It's calm, grounded non-pursuit. This doesn't mean playing games, acting cold, or pretending you don't care. It means responding with quiet self-respect and emotional stability instead of anxiety. When you don't chase, don't over-explain, and don't try to force clarity in the moment, you remove the very trigger that made them retreat in the first place. Suddenly, the dynamic changes. Instead of feeling crowded, they feel space. Instead of bracing for more emotional demand, they experience a sense of relief. And that relief is powerful, because it interrupts their usual cycle of distancing. It also creates something unexpected in their mind, curiosity. When you don't react the way they anticipated, it challenges their assumptions about you and about relationships in general. You're no longer fitting into the pattern they're used to, where closeness leads to pressure. Instead, you become associated with ease, which is rare and disarming for someone with avoidant tendencies. This doesn't guarantee they'll come back or suddenly change their behavior, and it's important to stay realistic about that. But it does open a door that would otherwise remain shut. The key is that this response isn't about trying to manipulate their feelings. It's about regulating your own. By staying centered, respecting their space, and not abandoning your own boundaries in the process, you create a completely different emotional experience for both of you. And in that shift, they begin to rethink not just the situation, but their reaction to it, because for the first time, distance doesn't feel like the only safe option. When someone with avoidant tendencies pulls away, the instinct to chase can feel almost impossible to resist. You want answers, reassurance, some sign that the connection still matters. But the truth is, chasing often drowns out the very thing that would have made an impact: your absence. Silence, when it comes from a place of self-control rather than hurt or manipulation, has a psychological weight that most people underestimate. It creates space not just physically, but mentally, allowing the other person to process the connection without feeling pressured or cornered. When you keep reaching out, explaining, or trying to fix things, you stay constantly present in a way that feels overwhelming to them. But when you step back, without drama, without ultimatums, you interrupt that pattern. Your energy is no longer something they need to defend against, and that shift can be surprisingly powerful. Silence gives them room to feel the absence of your attention, to notice the difference between having you there and not having you there. It also subtly communicates self-respect. You're not abandoning yourself just to keep them close. And that's where the intrigue builds, because instead of reacting predictably, you become harder to read. They may start to wonder why you didn't chase, why you didn't push, why you seemed okay letting things be, and that curiosity can bring your presence back into their mind in a more intentional way. This doesn't mean silence is a guaranteed way to pull someone back, and it shouldn't be used as a tactic to control outcomes. Its real power lies in what it does for you. It helps you break the cycle of overextending and reacting from fear. From that grounded place, the dynamic naturally shifts. Instead of trying to force connection, you allow it the space to either return on its own terms or reveal that it wasn't sustainable to begin with. Either way, silence becomes less about losing them and more about regaining your own clarity. And ironically, that's often what makes the strongest impression. One of the most confusing things about avoidant behavior is the contradiction at its core. They can genuinely want connection, intimacy, and emotional closeness, yet react to those very things by pulling away. It's not that they're pretending or being inconsistent on purpose. It's that two opposing drives are operating at the same time. On one side, there's the natural human desire to feel understood, supported, and connected to someone. On the other, there's a deeply ingrained need to protect their independence and avoid emotional overwhelm. When things are light, easy, and a bit distant, they often feel comfortable and engaged. But as soon as the connection starts to deepen, when expectations grow, emotions intensify, or vulnerability increases, that internal alarm gets triggered. Closeness begins to feel less like comfort and more like pressure, even if nothing explicitly changed on your end. This is why their behavior can seem so unpredictable. One moment they're present and invested, the next they're distant and hard to reach. It's not because their feelings disappeared overnight, but because their fear response took the lead. And here's where it becomes emotionally complex for both sides. They don't just distance from you, they often distance from their own feelings as well, creating a kind of emotional shutoff that helps them regain control. At the same time, that desire for connection doesn't vanish. It lingers in the background, which is why they may reappear once the intensity fades or the pressure subsides. This push and pull dynamic can be deeply frustrating if you're trying to make sense of it through a straightforward lens. But it starts to make more sense when you recognize that their behavior is driven by both attraction and self-protection at once. Understanding this paradox doesn't mean you should tolerate inconsistency or ignore your own needs. It simply helps you stop personalizing their withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. When you see that they both fear and crave closeness, you can approach the situation with more clarity, setting healthier boundaries while also not getting pulled into the emotional whiplash of their shifting behavior. What you do in the moments after they pull away matters far more than most people realize, because this is where the entire dynamic either resets in your favor or locks into a pattern that keeps pushing them further away. It's easy to think their decision is already made, that the outcome is out of your hands, but with someone who has avoidant tendencies, the story is often still unfolding beneath the surface. They're watching, consciously or not, how you respond to distance, whether you react with urgency, emotion, and pursuit, or with calm, grounded self-respect. Most people, driven by fear of loss, immediately try to close the gap. They reach out more, seek explanations, or try to reestablish connection as quickly as possible. But this is exactly what reinforces the avoidance instinct to stay away, because it confirms their belief that closeness leads to pressure and emotional demand. On the other hand, when you choose a different response, when you allow space without chasing, when you maintain your own rhythm, instead of revolving around their withdrawal, you shift the emotional tone of the situation entirely. You're no longer adding intensity to something they're already trying to regulate. Instead, you're creating an environment where returning feels easier, not harder. This is where the stakes come in. Your reaction can either validate their need to keep distance or quietly challenge it. And that doesn't mean pretending not to care or suppressing your feelings. It means not letting those feelings dictate impulsive actions that work against you. When you stay composed, respect their space, and keep your sense of self intact, you become someone they associate with emotional safety rather than pressure. That association can linger in their mind long after the initial distance, making them more open to re-engaging when they've had time to process. Of course, there are no guarantees, and not every situation leads to reconnection, but your response is still a powerful influence. It determines whether the door stays slightly open or closes more firmly, and that's a level of control most people overlook in the moment they need it most. Mixed signals from someone with avoidant tendencies can feel like emotional whiplash. One moment they're warm, present, and engaged, and the next they're distant, quiet, or seemingly uninterested. It's easy to interpret this as inconsistency, lack of clarity, or even manipulation, but the underlying psychology is often much more complex and far less intentional than it appears. At the core, these mixed signals come from an internal conflict between two competing systems: the desire for connection and the instinct for self-protection. When they feel safe and in control, their natural interest and emotional availability can come through clearly, which is why you might experience moments of genuine closeness and chemistry. But as that connection deepens or begins to carry more emotional weight, their protective side activates, creating a sudden need for distance. This shift isn't always conscious. They may not even fully understand why their feelings seem to change. From the outside, it looks like they're sending contradictory messages, but from the inside, they're responding to fluctuating levels of comfort and overwhelm. Another layer to this is how they manage vulnerability. Expressing feelings or committing to emotional intimacy can feel risky, so they may alternate between opening up and pulling back as a way to maintain balance. This creates a pattern where just as things start to feel stable, they step away to regain a sense of independence. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing behavior that leaves you confused or unsettled, but it does help you see that the inconsistency is rooted in their internal regulation, not necessarily in a calculated effort to mislead you. When you recognize that their mixed signals reflect their struggle to stay connected while also feeling safe, it becomes easier to respond with clarity rather than confusion. Instead of trying to decode every shift or chasing consistency through more effort, you can focus on what remains steady on your side: your boundaries, your pace, and your emotional stability. And in doing so, you stop getting pulled into the cycle of reacting to every high and low, which is often what makes those mixed signals feel so powerful in the first place. When someone pulls away, the most natural reaction is to close the distance. Text more, call, explain yourself, try to fix whatever just broke. It feels logical, even responsible, because in most situations in life, effort helps repair things. But with avoidant dynamics, that instinct often produces the opposite result. Chasing doesn't just increase contact, it increases emotional pressure, and that pressure is exactly what triggers their withdrawal in the first place. From their perspective, even well-intentioned pursuit can start to feel like demand for clarity, demand for reassurance, demand for emotional presence they may not feel ready to give. So instead of calming the situation, chasing unintentionally amplifies the very discomfort they're trying to escape. What makes this especially difficult is that chasing usually comes from anxiety, not strategy. There's a fear of losing the connection, a need to restore certainty, and a hope that if you just say the right thing or try one more time, things will return to how they were. But the more you push into their space, the more their nervous system reads the situation as overwhelming. That's when distance increases. Not because they don't care at all, but because they care and feel pressured at the same time. This creates a push-pull loop where one person moves closer out of fear and the other moves away out of discomfort. The tension comes from realizing that your most instinctive reaction can actually work against your goal. Instead of restoring connection, it can reinforce their need for separation, and this is where the shift in understanding becomes important. It's not about playing games or pretending to be indifferent. It's about recognizing that connection can't be forced through urgency. When chasing stops, something interesting happens. The emotional intensity drops, and with it, the pressure they associate with you. That space doesn't guarantee they will return, but it does change the emotional environment you're operating in. Ultimately, the harm in chasing isn't just about pushing them away. It's also about what it does to you. It pulls you out of self-control and into reactive behavior, where your actions are driven by fear rather than clarity. And in avoidant dynamics, that shift is often what keeps the cycle going instead of breaking it. Detachment is often misunderstood as coldness, indifference, or emotional withdrawal. But in the context of avoidant dynamics, it operates in a very different way. True detachment is not about playing games or pretending you don't care. It's about stepping out of emotional overinvestment and returning to your own center. And counterintuitively, this shift is often what creates the strongest psychological impact on someone who is pulled away. When a person expects pursuit, emotional pressure, or repeated attempts to reconnect, their mind is prepared for a familiar pattern. But when that pattern suddenly stops, something subtle changes in how they perceive the situation, and in some cases how they perceive you. To understand why detachment triggers curiosity, it helps to look at what chasing does to the dynamic. When you pursue someone who is distancing themselves, you are essentially filling the space they are trying to create. Even if your intentions are loving or sincere, the emotional effect is often intensity without pause. For someone who already leans avoidant, that intensity can feel like loss of control. Their natural response is to increase distance, not because they are entirely disconnected, but because they are trying to regulate their internal state. This creates a cycle where the more one person pursues, the more the other retreats. Detachment interrupts that cycle when you stop chasing, not in a performative way, but in a grounded, emotionally regulated way. You remove the pressure that was fueling their withdrawal. Suddenly, the emotional environment changes. There is no longer a constant stream of messages, explanations, or attempts to reestablish closeness. Instead, there is space, and in that space, something unexpected happens. The absence of your pursuit becomes noticeable. Human psychology is highly sensitive to contrast. We often don't fully register the presence of something until its intensity changes. So when someone who was previously emotionally active and engaged becomes calm, steady, and less reactive, the brain naturally begins to take notice. This is where curiosity begins to form, not as a calculated manipulation, but as a natural response to change. For an avoidant person, this shift can feel especially striking. They are often used to relationships following a predictable emotional rhythm. Closeness leads to overwhelm. Overwhelm leads to distance, and distance is followed by pursuit. When that rhythm is disrupted, when pursuit doesn't immediately follow their withdrawal, it creates cognitive dissonance. Instead of the expected reaction, they encounter something different, stability without pressure. This stability is what makes detachment powerful. It reframes your presence in their mind. Instead of being associated with urgency, emotional demand, or unresolved tension, you begin to be associated with calmness and self-possession. And that contrast can naturally spark curiosity. Not necessarily curiosity about reconciliation right away, but curiosity about why things feel different, why you didn't react the way they expected, and what has changed in you. There is also a deeper psychological layer at play, unfinished emotional loops. When a connection ends abruptly or becomes inconsistent, the mind tends to leave it partially unresolved. If one person continues to push for closure or connection, the loop often stays emotionally charged and reactive. But when that pressure stops, the emotional intensity can begin to settle, and once it settles, reflection becomes possible. Detachment creates the conditions for that reflection by removing the immediate emotional demand. It is important, however, to distinguish between healthy detachment and emotional suppression. Healthy detachment is grounded in self-respect. It means you still acknowledge your feelings, but you are not governed by them in a reactive way. You allow space for uncertainty without trying to control the outcome. Emotional suppression, on the other hand, is when you shut down feelings entirely in an attempt to appear unaffected. That often creates internal tension and eventually leads back to reactivity. What makes detachment feel powerful is not that it wins someone back, but that it restores balance. It shifts the focus away from trying to manage another person's reactions and back toward your own emotional stability. Ironically, this is often what makes you more noticeable again. Not because you are trying to be noticed, but because you are no longer operating from a place of urgency. From the other person's perspective, especially someone who is used to emotional intensity or pursuit, detachment can feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity naturally creates a tension. When the expected emotional script is no longer followed, the mind starts to question what changed. That questioning is the seed of curiosity. However, it is essential to remain grounded in reality here. Detachment is not a guaranteed method to make someone return, and it should never be used as a hidden strategy to control outcomes. People may or may not come back, and their decisions depend on many factors beyond your behavior. The real value of detachment lies in how it changes your internal state. You are no longer chasing reassurance or trying to force clarity in a moment of emotional uncertainty. Instead, you are allowing space for clarity to emerge naturally. In many cases, what detachment truly does is reveal the actual state of the connection. If someone returns, it often happens because they feel less pressure and more clarity. If they do not, it becomes clearer that the dynamic was not stable or mutual enough to sustain. Either way, you gain something important: perspective that is not distorted by anxiety-driven action. Detachment also changes how you are experienced in relationships moving forward. When you learn to respond from a grounded place rather than a reactive one, you naturally become less entangled in cycles of pursuit and withdrawal. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means your care is no longer expressed through urgency or self-abandonment. At its core, detachment is less about influencing someone else and more about recalibrating your own emotional posture. And when that shift happens authentically, it often changes the entire tone of the dynamic. Not because you are trying to trigger curiosity, but because you are no longer trapped in a pattern that suppresses it. The idea behind every avoidant wishes you do this after they reject you ties into a common misunderstanding about avoidant behavior: that rejection is final, intentional, and emotionally clear-cut. In reality, what looks like rejection is often a protective response rooted in discomfort with emotional intensity, not necessarily a complete loss of interest. From a psychological perspective often associated with attachment theory, and echoed in broader Jungian ideas about inner conflict and self-protection, avoidant individuals tend to oscillate between the desire for closeness and the fear of being overwhelmed by it. This creates a push and pull dynamic where distance is used as a form of emotional regulation. The hidden truth this type of content usually points to is not that there is a secret action that guarantees someone will come back, but rather that your response after rejection significantly shapes the emotional tone of the dynamic. Chasing, over-explaining, or reacting from panic often intensifies their need for space because it reinforces their fear of emotional pressure. On the other hand, calm detachment, self-respect, and allowing space can interrupt that cycle, not as a manipulation tactic but as a way of removing pressure and restoring balance. The deeper conclusion is that avoidant behavior cannot be solved by doing the perfect reaction. Instead, it reveals something more important about emotional dynamics in general. Connection cannot grow under pressure, and self-abandonment is never the price of being chosen. Whether someone returns or not is never fully in your control, but how you respond determines whether you remain stuck in a cycle of anxiety and pursuit, or step into emotional clarity and stability. Ultimately, the most grounded takeaway is this: avoidant rejection is less about a definitive ending and more about a moment of emotional distance. What happens next should not be driven by fear of losing them, but by your ability to stay centered, respect space, and maintain your own emotional integrity, regardless of the outcome.